Well, good morning. We're back in action. We're going to spend some time with the agency and food and markets. Well, probably they know what they want to talk about, so we're going to assume no as well. So, Abby, is it going to be you that starts out?
Yeah, I would love to start and then have Madison join. Would that
Come on up,
Does
please.
that work for us? Okay.
Abby Willard, Director of Agriculture Development Division Director.
That's right. So yeah, for the record, Abby Willard, Agency of Agriculture. I just came back from the dermatologist, so pardon the distraction of.
Wouldn't have noticed if you had
this is what happens in this like lifestyle of working outdoors and living in this northern climate. Okay, so I did want to do a screen share just so we shared some documents with you, but then also wanted to make sure that we could review them today. So let me see if I can figure this out. Madison did it for us last time. She was much better.
Yeah. So I'll be that way.
Okay, can you all see it? Okay, great. Well, thanks for having us. We're excited.
Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, to come in and talk about a grant program from fiscal year 24 that we refer to as the Ag Development Grants, which were infrastructure investment grant programs for the meat, maple, and produce industry. And the kind of the impetus, I think, from the legislature to kind of make a focused attention on meat, maple, and produce was in response to priorities that came out of the Agriculture and Food System Strategic Plan that you heard about from Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund last week from Jake and Ellen. And then in the Future of Ag Commission report that made a particular focused priority around infrastructure investments in diversification of agriculture. So recognizing that we're seeing sort of this trend occurring in the dairy economy, even though it's still our largest, contributing ag sector, we're still seeing a loss of farms, this loss of agricultural land and active production, growth in sales in meat and produce and in maple, but not necessarily the accompanying infrastructure investments at the same time. So the objective of the agriculture development grants was to make a really concentrated effort in infrastructure investment in these three sectors. And Madison managed one of the programs that was focused on meat, and so, on maple. And so Madison's here to be able to talk us through the process that she went through and the review process and the prioritization within the applications that were received. And I'm just going to show a high-level overview of the program. What was most significant about the Ag Development Grants is we ran it for 1 year in fiscal year 24. There were not funds appropriated in 25, and it was not as part of the governor's recommend for fiscal year 26. But in fiscal year 24, we received over $44 million in demand from the meat, produce, and maple community.
And who funded the money? Was it the state that funded
State appropriation, yep. Sort of like enabled by this body as a one-time appropriation. In the Future of Ag Commission report, we asked for, which is another project that we could talk about at some point with this committee. Senator Collmore's heard about this, but the governor initiated an executive order 3 years ago to put together a commission on looking towards the viability of the future of agriculture in Vermont. And there were 3 different consecutive reports that were produced in the fall of 21, 22, and 23. And in one of those reports was the recommendation for $20 million to be appropriated towards infrastructure investments in these 3 sectors. In the governor's recommend in fiscal year 24, there was $10 million. And then what ended up being in the budget was $2.3 million, which is what we had to work with for this grant program. So we had over 500 applications requesting over $44 million. We funded 25 projects at $2.1 million. What you can see in this chart, which I think is a helpful summary just to sort of break apart the different sectors. So there was meat producers that could apply as well as meat processors. They were combined in one request for applications with the produce industry, and we had a staff member within the Ag Development Division that managed that. And then maple was a standalone application that Madison managed. In the state appropriation language was the expectation that 25% of the funds would be dedicated to the maple industry. So that's where around $524,000 was appropriated to the maple sector. You can see that produce had over 11 million in asks and about just over $1 million that was appropriated. Most of the produce applications were from diversified applications, or diversified operations. There were 76 applications and we funded 7 projects. In meat, as a program, we made the decision to differentiate between meat producers and meat processors since their needs and the scale of the projects were quite different. Collectively, there was just about 15 million in requests and we funded just over $500,000 and 6 projects. In maple was where we saw the largest response and one of the largest responses from any individual sector ever that our economic development programs have experienced. So there was over 330 applications from within the maple community requesting over 17.5 million. We funded the 25% as statutorily expected with 12 projects. What we did see in the key themes was a lot of similarity. In the produce industry, a lot of the projects were requesting for post-harvest infrastructure, so wash pack setups, which again was a lot of the infrastructure investment that Jake and Ellen referenced last week, is that as produce operations are expanding and reaching new wholesale markets, they need to improve their wash pack capability, which is kind of that post-harvest processing capacity. In the meat sector, most of the meat producer applications were from the beef industry, though there was a variety of other sectors that applied. And most of those applications were focused on like animal husbandry, animal well-being. So handling infrastructure, as well as then kind of managing the meat if they were doing some on-farm processing. In the maple industry, there were applications from producers that were just sap collectors and those that actually made sap into maple syrup. And most of those applications were focused around infrastructure improvement. So whether that was an expanded or an improved evaporator or vacuum in the sugar woods, looking at reverse osmosis to kind of make it more efficient, the processing of sap into syrup, and then infrastructure within the sugar house to be able to help do value-added processing or canning. So, yes.
Abby,
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Was there, so it sounds like most of that was existing businesses that expanded. Were there any startups included in that?
Yeah. I wonder if, Madison, do you want to speak to?
Yeah, there was.
Maybe just introduce yourself.
Oh, hi, I'm Madison. I am with.
What's your last name, Madison?
Madison Berry,
Thank
the
you.
Agricultural Development Division. I was the grant manager for the Maple Agricultural Development Grant. We had at least one startup organization within the Maple Grant, it's called Honeydew LLC, and they are a co-op maple organization, and we primarily funded them as a startup because we were interested in seeing their co-op model move forward using taps from retired sugars. And then I don't know that Meat and Produce funded any startups. They were allowed to apply, but we found that being competitive against such a large field was very difficult for a fresh startup.
It must have been hard to, I mean, it's just so many oversubscribed. That's unbelievable. I mean, I don't even know how you would pick winners and losers on that. I'm glad I didn't have to do that.
Talk through kind of what that review process looked like. Maybe one other highlight before moving into that review process, if you're open to that.
Yeah.
We were able to fund less than 5% of the demand. So there were still 700 applications that weren't funded and businesses that had desired projects that we weren't able to respond to. We did limit the application pool in some ways where we said applicants needed to either be looking at production efficiency, looking at climate resiliency, or food safety. And over 90% of the applications that came in were focused on production efficiency, which I think is really interesting and also not all that surprising when we look at kind of labor challenges and kind of the desire to sort of increase production and do it in a way that actually is economical and allows the business to kind of manage with the capacity that they have for labor and workforce.
So the the governor had recommended $10 million and it got reduced down to 2.3. That's just through the process of government. I mean, as legislators, that's what happened.
Yeah, I think it happened at the same time in the same session that there was a need for investment to support the organic dairy industry that was also hit really hard with Horizon's withdrawal. So there was $6.9 million that was appropriated to the agency in support of Horizon funded or Horizon supported organic dairy operations.
Okay, so the money wasn't used elsewhere outside of agriculture. It was just shuffled along in different programs for the most part.
I think you could look at it that way. Yeah, it was, I mean, I don't think we knew. This was the first time that the Ag Development Grants was launched in fiscal year 24. The vision was that it wasn't designed to be a one-time program. It was designed to be a multi-year investment in the infrastructure needs of supporting diversified agriculture. And I think we knew that $2.3 million was going to be a small response to the demand, but we didn't know that there would be 500 applications and over $40 million of demand. So it was we used the opportunity to do a little bit of a pilot experimentation, and Madison can join me in the conversation of this, but we elected not to provide a require match, which is something that we typically do for our granting programs, is expect that businesses have some match contribution required. Some of the feedback had been that that's making it difficult for small businesses to compete within our economic development program. So we use this as an opportunity to say match isn't required. I think it's over $30 million of match was contributed by applications simply because the projects are larger than the cap amount that they could apply for. So the businesses still did have to demonstrate match, but it wasn't a prerequisite to being eligible to apply.
When you are in government and you put out an initiative or a request for information or study and to say, well, how is agriculture going to be viable or going to the demand for needs and the wants, and then you get this type of request, it does open some eyes about what we could do as a state to make sure that we stayed in the forefront of agricultural production.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think when we received the appropriation in fiscal year 24, we held 2 different focus groups to connect with the industry to ask them, what is it that you need? Like, what do you want these grants to be focused on? How do you want them to be distributed? And so we also took the opportunity to engage with the industry early in the process to understand where the dollars could be best invested. And they gave us the feedback that they wanted it to be around production efficiency. They wanted to be able to do some climate smart or climate resiliency investments. And there was some that were focused on food safety and product quality. So those became kind of the 3 categories across all 3 sectors of meat, maple, and produce that were kind of the themes of focus. When we saw all the applications come in, there was also a lot of consistency in what people applied for. It was looking for processing capacity expansion, looking at storage capacity expansion. So again, storage could be SAP storage, could be storage of meat that's been slaughtered and packaged, or in the produce community. And then making a specialized equipment purchases and just general operational infrastructure growth. So again, we weren't surprised by those applications, but was reassuring to see them replicated across the industry type, that all 3 were looking for very much the same type of infrastructure project capacity growth.
Be interesting to hear feedback of what it did for these folks, even on a smaller scale, as far as what it did. But we always like testimonies, but we could get a lot of testimonies. We could spend the whole day on testimonies as far as what we do. But anyways,
well, we're more than happy to, if you wanted to hear. So one of the other documents that you have, and I'll stop this share and show you really quickly if I can, are the list of awardees. So there's 25 recipients that the Ag Development Grant supported, and I'm sure any of them would be happy to come in and provide testimony, and we could also kind of coordinate if there were certain individuals that you particularly wanted to hear from. But here's the list if that's of interest to you. So these are the 12 Maple recipients, which I think were located across 10 counties in Vermont. So many of them will be familiar to you as some are within your jurisdiction. These are the 6 meat operations, and they were spread, I mean, fewer awardees, but again, I think we saw applications from 10 or 11, every county in meat.
From every county across the program.
And then these are the 7 produce awardees. So some are small operations, others are quite large and more established. The awards also vary in size. So some are relatively small and some of them are relatively large investments. To have $269,000 invested in a business is also pretty significant grant size.
Yes.
Did I hear you correctly? There were 500 applications?
Mm-hmm.
Total.
Yeah.
And
Across meat, maple, and
right,
produce, yes.
right, total. And you awarded 25.
So we could have kept that, all that money's in there, we would have had possibly over 100 awardees using that formula.
And the total ask of those 500 applications was 44 million. 44 million. And we had 2.3 million to give out.
We had 2.3 million appropriated. We retained $200,000 for staff capacity,
Yeah.
so we awarded 2.1 million in awards.
I think it's just an interesting and maybe useful point to say that, you know, obviously anyone can submit an application,
Sure.
and some of them did not score well for various reasons. But if you look at the applications based on the average score for each program, which was about 78 across all 3, interestingly enough, any applications that scored 78 or above, it was 9.2 million in maple and 12.6 million in meat and produce in sort of unmet need there.
So 21 million in high value
high-scoring
applications.
So in essence, about 10%.
Of the total applications were high quality
Yeah.
or ready, you know, kind of like applicant ready. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's about right. Yeah.
Wow.
So Chair Ingalls, you'd asked about the review process and sort of like how selections were made.
Yes,
So would it be
absolutely.
possible to add Madison into this conversation?
Absolutely.
So the one detail that I can share is that we have a very established process within the Ag Development Division of how we review grants. We called upon 110 reviewers across the agency and across our partner organizations to be able to review applications, since every application gets 3 reviews. So that we have, you know, a broad perspective. We're ensuring as much equity and consideration in the reviews. Each reviewer completes a conflict of interest assessment to ensure that they don't have any kind of connection or, you know, relationship to any of the applicants, or if they do, then they, you know, accept a conflict of interest and they don't review that application. There were 2 different requests for applications. So as I mentioned, Maple was a standalone RFA that went out there. It was well promoted by the maple industry. Bless you.
Thank you.
By the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association in particular. I think they sent postcards to every member of the maple industry so that they had access to and awareness of the funding opportunity, which definitely resulted in more applications coming in the maple sector. But also really wonderful to see the Maple Sugar Makers Association had been part of that early stage discussion of what would you like to see in the maple industry application. So they were very invested in the program. And then the meat producers and processors and produce industry were captured in another request for application. So we decided to couple those 2. In the future, I think the recommendation is that we would not couple them, that we would run a separate one for the produce industry, a separate application for produce, a standalone application for meat processors, and a standalone application for meat producers, just to ensure that they each got that same kind of targeted industries focused attention that the maple applications received. What would you offer about the maple process, Madison?
With the maple process, I mean, it was definitely the largest review process I've ever run. I just ran one for my other grant program and I had 12 reviewers, so having 63 reviewers for maple was quite the feat. And we pulled folks from, Cornell, UMaine, across multiple, forestry areas of focus, and the same thing was kind of reflected in the meat and produce. We were really looking for either experts in that area or at least experts in agricultural businesses. Every application was scored 3 times by 3 different reviewers, and they have a rubric within the request for applications that includes alignment with funding priorities, alignment with program outcomes, quality of project plan, efficient use of funds, evidence of technical expertise, and evidence of a long-term impact. So everything was reviewed and scored on those areas, and then using those scores as well as a sort of holistic 1 out of 5 or 1 to 5 scoring process, we were able to kind of pare that down to so the applications we wanted to discuss in person using an internal ag dev plus other members of the AAFM community. We talked about 84 maple applications and 70 meat and produce applications sort of in person, which turned out to be quite the marathon. And within those conversations, we talked about things like the project score and how it relates to the scoring criteria. We kind of approached it more from the granting expert side versus just the reviewer side. We looked at the feasibility and reasonability of projects. Some scored really well, but we had questions about feasibility or whether it could actually be executed according to what the application said. And then we also were really looking at diversity of project types, locations, and operations. So one really big area of focus was making sure that we spread it across the state, even though obviously maple is focused in certain areas of the state, dairy in other areas. So we tried to balance that out as we went. And then we also looked at previous division funding history. So if they had received a large working lands grant in the last 3 years, that factored in. It didn't necessarily disqualify them, but it did factor in.
Yes.
And how was the money dispersed? Just got a check? Just dispersed with a check, or did they have to give invoices and say, this is exactly where the money went?
There's a reimbursement, sort of do a reimbursement process. So the grant agreements all vary by recipient, but typically it's 50% up front to cover the cost right out of the gate. They do provide us with a budget, and they do provide us with quotes from their contractors and anything relevant to sort of indicate how much they'll be spending. And then after an interim report where they give an update, they talk about how far the project has come, they give any challenges or difficulties they've had, as well as give pictures and sort of proof of life, as it were. They get another 40%, and then the final payout comes after a final report, which includes tracked objectives and measurable outcomes, as well as a budget and receipts for the work that they've done.
So start to finish, how long on average? I know everyone's a little different.
For the total project
to
completion?
How many?
1 to 2 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 18 to 24 months usually.
All of the maple projects will be finished after this sugaring season, because many of them rely on tracked objectives that only come during sugaring season.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the meat and produce, some of them go into 2026.
Are we the only one that kind of blown away by this, how much of a ask there was or need from that? I mean, not to put pressure on anyone by any way, shape, or form, but hey, let's do that again.
I think across the board was surprise in the demand that the program received. And as I think I have shared with this committee previously, our fiscal year 24 across all economic development programs at the Agency of Agriculture was over $108 million in requests in the Ag Development Division alone. So the demand that was experienced in fiscal year 24, which was a result of a rough 2023 production year, the first flood, was, I think, factors that influenced the demand. I think the particular focus in these three sectors was also appreciated, but also not surprising, that like these have not been industries that we have wholly invested in response to the production that they have shown as an increase in the last 5 years. And so we've done a similar presentation in the House Ag, Food Resiliency and Forestry Committee as well. It's certainly a priority investment area for our agency. With the governor's recommend, we have $1 million in the Working Lands Program, which is our kind of annual base appropriation that we typically have seen in the last few years. We make investments in meat and produce and maple sectors through the Working Lands Program. I think, again, the question becomes the demand. So for the Working Lands Program, in fiscal year 24, we had over $16 million in requests, and we had about $3 million to grant. So this is a thread, theme that we're seeing throughout the ag sector right now. Of they are aware of the funding opportunities that are offered by the Ag Development Division at the agency. They are getting the technical assistance support that they need to write applications. They understand, and there's some reliability around the program funds that are being made available. And so more and more businesses are applying, which is exactly what we wanted them to do, to sort of feel like they had the reassurance that these state programs will be there. You can apply year after year. You may not get it, but you can apply again, and you hope that the same program will be offered in a subsequent year. So I would say that's our objective. That's our hope, is that we're creating that opportunity of consistency and appropriately supported programs for the industry to respond to.
So I'm sorry to not mean to throw you off and to keep on dwelling on this, but for me it's very powerful. And I used to ask this question when I was on transportation, and it's not in any way, shape, or form a critique of anything other than, do we have the resources within your departments to chase down federal dollars that we could chase down? I mean, I know in institutions, we were able to chase down, or A&R was able to chase down 15-to-1 match monies. In transportation, we were doing the same thing, 14-to-1 match monies as far as dollars and all of that. Do we have the same capacity within agriculture to chase down these dollars?
Yep, and we do.
Yeah,
so,
I'm not saying that you don't.
Yeah,
I just want to make sure that if we could ever do anything to help with that, if we didn't have it. So I'll let you answer.
Yeah, no, it's an appropriate question, and I'm happy to respond. So the economic development funds that we bring in that are federally oriented are significant amount of resources focused on dairy. So the Northeast Dairy Business Innovation Center, which you had Laura Ginsberg come in and speak to the kind of the impact of those investments in Vermont and across the region. So that's been, $11 million of infrastructure investment just in Vermont for the dairy economy, which is federal funds. We have a specialty crop block grant program that's supported by U.S. Department of Agriculture that Madison also manages, and that brings in like $300,000, give or take, every year for investments in the specialty crop industry, which includes the produce community, as well as Christmas trees and mushrooms and hemp and nursery and maple. Yeah. That's a relatively small portion of funds, which is configured on a calculation that USDA does nationally, and based upon the growing but still modest sales that we receive from the specialty crop sector, determines what our state's appropriation is. So it's increased over time. It used to be like 180, 190, then 250, and now it's been 300, 330 in the last couple of years. We have not received our total amount for this fiscal year that we're appropriating, even though the funding opportunity is live and active right now. We also received funding through U.S. Department of Agriculture called the Resilient Food System Infrastructure Grants, which was a first-time appropriation of a few $1 million to Vermont for us. I think it was $3.5 million for us to invest in what's referred to as middle of the supply chain. So it had to be post-production investments and pre-market access. So it was like focused on a lot of the things that these meat, maple, and produce applicants actually asked for, which was storage and processing capacity expansion for value-added products. So we're awaiting the kind of approval from USDA so we can make those awards. And that's a pretty big kind of opportunity for the many applications that we received through that program. But again, it's a one-time program at this point. We'll see if it's reappropriated and could be authorized in the future Farm Bill, but it's not currently. There are also federal resources that have been made available recently for meat slaughter and processing. One of the challenges that we find in Vermont is that the federal programs are modeled after a scale of agriculture that doesn't exist in Vermont. Right. So many of the meat slaughter and processing funds, which was a priority of the previous federal administration, was to kind of overcome what we realized in COVID was that we had concentrated meat processing into a few facilities across the country, and they wanted to kind of like break that monopoly kind of structure. The way that all of those funding opportunities were written was that it was impossible for, or nearly impossible for Vermont scale businesses to be competitive. I think we got 2 funded projects out of the millions of dollars that were invested in the meat slaughter and processing across the country. And so that's where we often have the ability to tailor the programs to our scale and our kind of industry needs when it's state dollars. But we certainly try. We provided a lot of technical assistance on those federal meat slaughter applications and helped connect businesses to the resources and to find grant writing support. And again, it just isn't always the right fit for our businesses.
Committee, on Wednesday, we have the federal delegation coming in of the 2 senators and representatives, and I want to make sure we ask that same question. As are they doing enough to partner with our state folks to make sure that they can secure these dollars and to help them. And sorry, I'm not meaning to step on your toes because I know you guys asked them, but we want to also ask them as well to make sure that they're doing their part versus whatever they might find more important to do. We want to make sure that they're doing everything they can do to help you.
Yeah, not at all. I think we have stayed in connection with the congressional delegation around the meat capacity applications in particular, and they're aware of the resilient food system infrastructure funds we have.
To make sure that they're on all of the parts. So when you see a list like this with 500 applications, chasing down $2.3 million and getting to 44 million, it just tells me that somewhere along the way we need to find some more money for them. We just do. We just got to do it. And it's not, we only have what we have. And, that's just huge. It's just, it's a lot of money. And, we're a dairy state, we're a dairy committee. We need to make sure we do our parts to ask the questions of the federal delegation as well. Can we chase down some more money? We certainly, this right here illustrates need.
Yes.
So.
I think one learned lesson from this fiscal year 24 kind of appropriation process that we are using going forward is that there is a distinction between applications that we're looking for like cost of doing business improvements, so they just wanted something a little bit bigger or a little bit newer, versus applications that we're looking for true innovation or expansion or diversification. And so I think we did not make cost of doing business applications ineligible in fiscal year 24, so they could apply, but they didn't rank as highly in the review process that Madison described, in particular for maple. But I think that's an opportunity going forward for us to really, it's another way for us to differentiate and say, as much as we'd love to help businesses sort of just like add a new piece of equipment, we may not have the capacity to do that, but we could focus on innovation or diversification or expansion in new and different products or new and different markets. So we could see less applications if we were kind of, narrowing the eligibility in that way.
And the reason why I do it, and to the committee, this is really for the committee. Many of you might know or whatever, but I'm in business, and I just bought a new business, and I've had meetings yesterday with my new people, and I challenge them, So, okay, well, here you go. This is where we need to get to, and here's an easy challenge. And so that's why I kind of want to do that federal delegation. I want to challenge them to find us more money. sorry.
Yeah, we're very equipped to kind of bring federal resources in, and even in the next fiscal year, I think there's over, I'm not actually looking at those notes, but there was like 5 different programs that we're bringing federal resources into Vermont, into our economic development programs. And so it's not, there's no hindrance to those resources coming into our programs. We have to build the capacity and we have to plan for it, but it's a very common
You have
part of
room,
our
you have
operation.
room to find, you have room to put that money out there should more show up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Was there something going on?
I just wanted to share the observation that a lot of the federal funds also aren't infrastructure focused. The RFSI, the Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure for sure, the things like specialty crop, the Easter grant that is a maple focused USDA grant, those are all sort of focused on research or market development, et cetera. And I think part of the reason we had such a high demand within ADG as well as working lands was that it was pure, it could be for pure infrastructure improvements or for innovation, et cetera. So I think that's also a conflict with the federal funds that we have access to. What they're focused on and what the allowable costs are may not necessarily be what our farmers specifically need.
No, I get that.
Yeah.
I get all of that. But, one of the questions that I get asked all the time in politics, and I learned real quick, was this: well, why don't we just not spend the money? Well, don't listen. We're gonna spend the money. Our job is to make sure it comes here. And that is really what the battle is, because it's a big country. And as you've said, I get it on the meat producer part of it. We're just a small scale where, when you can go out in the Midwest and they've got these, thousands, and I mean, they're butchering more cows in one day or livestock in one day than we would in 10 years' time. But it doesn't mean that it's any more important out there than it is here. In fact, the impact would probably be more impactful here. So that's why I dwell on that a little bit. So.
Yeah, we certainly, again, in the presentation that Ellen and Jake did for the committee last week, this realization that if the Northeast region wants to be more food resilient, a lot of that production and processing capacity actually needs to come from Vermont and Maine as the 2 states that remain with open agricultural land accessible and possible, as opposed to Rhode Island or Connecticut or most of Massachusetts, where like that open possibility for expansion in agricultural land isn't possible.
Well, you look at the small area there as well, and you just hit it really well. You look at the small area where we are, and you look at the population masses, and we probably have more of a need for a lot of that stuff to feed our own. Right. And with limited amounts of land, because you go out west, it's just vast, but anyways.
Yeah, and again, we are seeing from businesses a desire to feed their neighbors, feed their community, but also expand and grow production so that they can reach regional retail markets outside of the state. And they recognize that we have major metropolitan markets that they have close access to. And we have distribution models that are sort of getting that product to other eaters outside of our state. And so we have spent a lot of time over the past 2 decades really trying to support all the sides of that equation so that it's not just growing more food, but it's also making sure we have the infrastructure to get it to the markets, make sure that we have the partnership between Vermont and other states. And I think we are in like a really important and ripe opportunity to kind of take advantage of the fact that people do still choose to move to Vermont and start businesses. And we're fortunate that we have entrepreneurs that come here and they're excited about growing food. They want to serve and reach new markets. And I think we have a lot of the pieces in place to encourage that, which is very exciting, actually, to be involved in economic development.
Well, cool. Did we get through it all?
I think we shared, what we wanted to
any
share.
questions?
Cool.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the discussion.
Of course.
Very, very helpful. We appreciate it very much.
Yeah, I know, it's not always the best of news these days, but it's still good information.
It leaves us for more, more topics to discuss with others that are coming in behind you. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for making the time.
Good.
Have a good day.
Okay, committee, I think